Resolute Square.
There was also maintained what was called an enemies list, which was rather extensive and continually being updated.
Democrats want Republicans dead.
Where I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose any voters, okay?
The women with the least likelihood of getting pregnant are the ones most worried about having abortions.
On January 6th of 2021, you had tens of thousands of people peacefully protesting.
So, it's not a right-wing conspiracy theory. It's not QAnon. It's real.
I'm Rick Wilson, and this is The Enemies List. Well, folks, welcome back once again to The Enemies List, and my guest today is Kevin Kruse. He is a brilliant historian who has a perspective on American history that I think you're going to really enjoy. And Kevin, to start out, thank you so much for coming on The Enemies List. And as I was saying just before we went on the air here, I think a lot of our politics is infected with this completely distorted, weird, false narrative about American history that has led us into these sort of rabbit holes in the last 50 years, maybe, that depend on an understanding of America that isn't real. And you've written a lot about it, including with your new book, Myth America, on just how distorted people's ideas of American history are. Let's talk about that a little bit, and then I want to get down into some cases on that front.
Yeah, well, our understanding of the past doesn't sit on its own, right? It dictates how we see the present and how we think about the future, right? So having a belief in kind of things that are wrong or simply off about the past can change how we act in the future. So if you think about, it used to be that Americans believed that Reconstruction was a failure, that the idea of going down and the federal government being involved in the South was a horrible problem, and it led to black misrule, and poor white Southerners were mistreated, and it was a mistake we should never do again. Well, in the 50s and 60s, a lot of American policymakers in both parties believed that as the gospel truth. It wasn't true, but they come to believe this false history, and they believed they shouldn't do anything in the South, right? And so it led to some real foot dragging when it came to the American government getting involved in the civil rights struggle in the South. So the consequences here play out time and time again, where thinking that a certain course of action is doomed to failure or a certain course of action will invariably succeed blinds us to the realities.
Right. And I think that idea, and so much of this, I think so much of the distortion of our historical understanding does wrap around race and the Civil War and the post-Civil War era and the division inside the Republican Party from that original, the more northeastern liberal Republican Party as it transformed and a lot of people switched positions and switched polarities, especially across the South, is something that it's hard for me to as a Southerner. It's hard for people to look away from the sort of comfortable myth-based reality of it and to just ignore it. And look, when I was a Republican, we used to have that hard line of we've never been racist. No one's ever racist. The country's not racist. There's no racism, and race doesn't matter. And it as our friend Stuart Stevens says, it was all a lie. And it does seem like that's the through line in so much of the distortion of our knowledge of America, is that race is this never, it's not just it's not simply the conflicts of race and around slavery, but the rewriting, the boulderizing, the rebooting of history over and over again, especially on the right, about the role of race in American society.
Yeah, it's really been remarkable. And I think what's really striking about the current era is that we reached that point of total denialism, right? Of saying that the Republican Party had never made any kind of appeals on race. Anytime you hear someone making kind of those grand statements about this has never happened in the history of X, you can generally be assured that's wrong.
Right.
And of course here it absolutely was wrong. And what's remarkable is again, we've reached this point where they're saying it's never happened. The Republican Party over previous decades had tried to reckon with that past, right?
Yes.
And so whether it was Lee Atwater in 1981 saying, look, you're saying the Reagan era appeals are racist. We're not. I freely admit, he said, that Nixon made coded appeals on racism. That was a race-based Southern strategy in the 60s. Atwater acknowledged at the time, but he said, we're different. Then in the Bush era, you had people like Ken Melman and Michael Steele, heads of the RNC, apologizing for the Southern strategy and saying, okay, look, we did some bad things back then, but we have now turned the page. And there, I think, unlike Atwater, I think they were sincere. They were sincere about trying to open the party up under the Bush era. There's a real effort to outreach to African Americans and Latinos and really make it a much more diverse party and to turn the page on that. Of course, before you turn the page, you got to acknowledge that page exists. In the Trump era, though, they've completely erased all of that and just said, no, we were the party of Lincoln from the start to today. There's never been any racism at all. And it's a complete disavowal of reality.
Well, and I can tell you, inside the Republican and the conservative world, there was this like you never varied. If Republicans are great at one thing, it's staying on message. You never varied from that message. Oh, the Southern strategy didn't exist. It was a lie. It was a fake. And it's weird because you could find these like alternating parts of their political character. Like Nixon in the 50s at one point gave this speech, and I dug it up one time, about ending segregation. I was like, well, that's something. And he was like, we can't survive as a nation with our cities segregated. And I was like, that's a contrast to what Ailes created with the silent majority strategy in the 1968 campaign. And you saw these people who, I remember reading the Blacks on or Merlin Earl Black on Rise of Southern Republicanism, and they were pretty honest about it, about how these white evangelicals were moving toward the Republicans because it was their coded way of expressing their anger on rising African American status and stature in places like Atlanta. And places like Charlotte.
Nixon's a great example of this switch, right? I think, people have forgotten Nixon in the 50s was wholly in keeping with that party of Lincoln tradition of the Republican Party. He was, unlike Eisenhower, Nixon was outspoken on civil rights. Nixon praised the Brown decision. Nixon met with Martin Luther King Jr. He was in Ghana, but he met with him and treated him like a dignitary. In the 1960 race, when Nixon first ran for president, the party has an aggressive civil rights plank, better than the Democrats. Right. It really is leaning in. It was kind of the Rockefeller wing of the party was there. Well, Nixon loses in 60, and there's a meeting I talk about in Myth America in the White House where Nixon and Eisenhower and Thruston Morton, who was the head of the RNC, basically say, look, we've been chasing the black vote. To hell with it. And that's literally what Thurston Morton says. To hell with it. And so there's this new attitude that takes place under Goldwater shortly thereafter, where Goldwater says, look, we got to go hunting where the ducks are. And the Republican Party starts hunting where the ducks are, which is to go after white Southern segregationists instead of kind of racial moderates in the South who are few and far between. And they make an appeal to that. And so Nixon changes course, right? And not immediately. Nixon comes out in favor of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Voting Rights Act of 65. He's still very much on the case there. But when he starts trying to win the Republican nomination in 68, he realizes the path goes through the South. And why did he go through the South? Because the RNC in 64 had awarded delegates for the next convention based on who voted for the party. Well, who voted for the party in 64? The Deep South. So the Deep South holds the key to the election in 68. So Nixon warms up to Strom Thurmond, who he'd previously reviled, and lets Strom Thurmond and Harry Dent, his advisor, basically vouch for him throughout the South. And that makes the case that wins him the nomination. Southern conservatives originally love Reagan. They want Reagan to be the nominee in 68. He's much more kind of a stalwart, and they see Nixon as this suspect guy who used to tout civil rights. But Nixon does a complete flip around and listens to these advisors. So it shows how flexible politicians could be on this really important issue. It also was the era where Ailes started to perfect the racial coding of crime as a message. And as I say to people all the time, whether you love or hate Roger Ailes, you cannot deny that he was an absolute genius of message marketing, television, and absolutely. And look, I had a
liberal friend get very mad at me one time. She's like, "Who have you learned from the most in your career?" And I'm like, "Listen, I used to sit with Roger and just ask him questions because I wanted to know how he did it, and he was a true genius." And it's a proof that genius can be turned to evil ends, obviously, between Fox and that. So one of the other areas,
and
go ahead.
Sorry, I got Nixon on Ailes, or Ailes on Nixon. We know Roger Ailes is this man who kind of created the Fox News empire.
Mm-hmm.
What he did with Nixon, though, is an amazing turnaround.
Oh, yeah.
And Ailes, I'm sure you've read it. Ailes' comments on Nixon when he gets the 68 campaign are brutal. They say, Nixon looks like a guy who was 42 years old the day he was born. Other kids got a football for Christmas. Young Richard Nixon got a briefcase and loved it. And he knew the challenge was to turn this guy who had zero charisma, really, and to make him into this kind of figure that the South especially could rally around.
Mm-hmm,
And the fact that he was able to do that with someone as bland and milquetoast as Nixon is really remarkable. But Ailes' genius was he realized that he could actually sell Nixon right down the middle, that the 68 campaign was the perfect chance for this because Hubert Humphrey was the Democratic nominee, longtime champion of civil rights. In fact, in 48 was the Speaker of the convention that helped spark the Dixiecrat revolt with his embrace of civil rights. He's the Democratic nominee. You've got George Wallace, diehard segregationist, running as an independent. Nixon could run right down the middle. And so his genius is that he makes an appeal to race that, compared to George Wallace, doesn't seem as bad. Doesn't seem as stark, right? And again, next to Wallace, no one could see that stark. But Ailes drives Nixon down that lane, and it's a really effective strategy, but other candidates would then follow.
There's an old Southernism. And if I had ever said the N-word as a child, my grandmother would have slapped my mouth out. I mean, she would have popped me. Yeah. I mean, that was my parents were civil rights liberals, and my grandmother, although she was raised in the very deepest of the deep South, was in that weird old guard, old Republican way. Like, Reconstruction was not bad. But there was an old joke that they used to say, like, don't be overtly racist because it gives intolerance a bad name. And that sort of was where I think a lot of the evangelical conservatives in the South and a lot of the racially motivated folks in the South, and this conceit with Republicans, like, oh, the Democrats were the party of segregation. Okay, guys, we have flipped the script. It is a changed demo. It is not the same. You can't, the idea of a continuity of a party doesn't hold up in American history. I mean, and the really remarkable part, when I hear today's conservatives claim that the party has never changed, you're writing the conservative pioneers out of a story, right? It used to be that the kind of Reagan Republicans would look back and say, Goldwater seized control of the party in the 60s, took it away from the Rockefeller liberals, changed the course. That's our founding narrative. Well, if you claim the party's never changed, you're writing out Goldwater, Reagan, Gingrich, all these people who shifted it over time, right? And the idea that the MAGA party of today is like the Republican Party that emerged after the Whigs collapsed after the Kansas-Nebraska Act is just it's like, what? And I guess that's another question I have is like, beyond the race question, the weird inversions of the party's positions as they flip-flop back and forth over time. Like, there was an era where the Democrats were the national security party. And then the Republicans took that, and now the Republicans have lost it again. How much do you see of that in American history, like this polarity flipping inside the parties? And where do you see it headed next? I mean, because I think the Democrats have an opportunity right now to recapture that national security vote that still is out there, in a way that they could not have had, ironically, if it wasn't for all the swaggering, tough-talking Trump era, BS that was not founded on anything. No, I think that's exactly right. And we've seen this throughout American history, and it's a nature of the two-party system, right? In which so much, especially in an era of increasing polarization, so much of a party's identity becomes, well, the other guys are X, we've got to be not X, and there are very few
points where they come together. I mean, we saw this recently on free trade, right?
Right.
Bill Clinton kind of glommed on to Republican ideas of free trade with NAFTA, and then Trump moved the party away from that, right, and rejected that. And so I think on national security, you're right. This had long been this issue. You know, Republicans in the 30s were hardcore isolationists, right? And Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman kind of had to drag them kicking and screaming into an internationalist vision. Well, then they became solid partners in the Cold War era. And increasingly, it was Democrats who started to back away from that from Vietnam on. And it was Republicans who stepped up and kind of claimed that mantle of a strong national security presence. But you're absolutely right. Under Trump, they've largely retreated from that. And I think you've seen the Biden administration, one of its quiet successes has been the work they've done in foreign policy. Maybe not quiet, but I think it's not given as much attention as it should. And I think the Democrats have really set this up. And so if Trump becomes the nominee again with this kind of, get out of Ukraine message and
seal the borders, that's going to work.
Yeah. I think the Democrats really have an option here to fill that void.
I think so too. One of the things about study of history and about history is that I think must be frustrating for a professional like you is how easily like the entertainment wing of the conservative movement has decided to rewrite history. And I look at the things like Prager University and Glenn Beck and all this weirdly inflected. Some of it is religiously driven to sort of say, oh, the founders were all like Southern Baptist evangelical God Squad guys. And some of it seems to me to be a lot darker. I mean, they sort of get they sort of get the underpinning philosophy that if you take control of what people believe our history is, you control their destiny. I mean, how dangerous are the conspiracy, like entertainment wing historians to us? Because I want to dismiss them. I want to say, oh, Glenn Beck's a kook and a freak and a weirdo. Yeah. But millions of people pay that guy $15 a month to listen to him talk, quote Robert Skousen or whoever these insane people who are so far out on the ledge.
Yeah, it really is alarming, and this is something that I think have alarmed professional historians, left, right, and center, and prompted us in the last decade or so to really engage much more with the general public. And we've always written op-eds and essays and things like that. But the beauty of social media, whether it be Twitter, Facebook, whatever, the 40,000 new social media sites that are now out there, is that it gives ordinary folks, ordinary historians at least, a chance to push back on this. And I think what a lot of us have realized in the last few years is thank God, there's a hunger out there among historians for history.
Yes. But
the problem is that they're getting it from some very suspect sources, right? You go into an airport bookstore and it's, all these Bill O'Reilly killing blanks, or Brian Kilmeade writing about the founders. These guys are not, I don't know what their intentions are.
Their ghostwriter for all those books is one of my neighbors. He lives like a mile away from me, and I know the guy. He's,
All right. Well, I congratulate him on his success. Right. But I'm sorry, we're going to try to knock him off the bestseller list if we can. But there's a real danger there. To be serious, that again, because these fictions, if people believe they're fact, they act on it, right? And it's not just the stories we tell about our past are stories that dictate our present and our future. And there's a real danger, I think, here in being led astray.
Yeah, I think that and it's so weaponized, it's so industrialized, and honestly, a lot of the times, and I say this as an ad maker and a writer, a lot of the times the production value on this stuff is convincing. It's some of it is well packaged and if you're not a reader or a thinker or somebody who's immersed yourself in history, you could be convinced like, oh, well, this sounds legitimate. This sounds like something real.
This is what, the PragerU model is. And this is what my essay in Myth America on Southern strategy is a response to a video that the political scientist Carol Swain did for PragerU. It's a tight, 5-10 minute video. Great production values, very slick, nice graphics. And I can see how it would be convincing. That's why I bothered first on Twitter and now in this piece to kind of push back on it. And it's easy to do these kind of things glibly, right?
Right.
And anytime you're getting your worldview in a 5-minute YouTube video, you should pause and think about that, right? Because these videos, it's easy to cherry pick different facts from the past and to throw them out as a constellation and say, look, that looks exactly like this, and I'm going to show you that that's ironclad proof, right? So I could sit here and say, you know, if we have the production values, you've got them, maybe we could do this. We could do a video where I insist that the historical record shows the Republican Party is the party of abortion rights. And let me tell you how.
I could make that argument and make it,
you can
package it up.
Ronald Reagan signed the California abortion liberalization law and made it in that state. Roe v. Wade, written by a Nixon appointee to the Supreme Court.
Yep.
You go on and on like this, right? And you can cherry pick little facts here and say, well, look at all those things. They were all Republicans. They all supported abortion rights. Therefore, here's the end conclusion. And it would be snappy, have some nice graphics behind it. We could get it out there and people would pass it along. A lot of this comes from the fact that people want to believe these things and are looking for people to give them a license to believe them, right? And the slick packaging and the kind of the glitzy promotions do this in a way that make these arguments sell. But the fact that someone's trying to sell you this history
should alert
should show you that. Yeah, it should warn you, but they're trying to make a buck off this for a reason.
Well, and somebody one time brilliantly described PragerU to me. He said these are videos to make people, you know, who are not educated feel educated, who do not have intellectual curiosity feel like they've been given some inside hermetic knowledge of the past. And that's always what drives his, like, conspiracy theories are appealing because they make people who do not have a wide view of the world around them. It gives them this consistent, coherent explanation of things they don't understand. And this is the way in which it's always packaged on Twitter. This is Dinesh D'Souza's favorite thing. God.
Hey, did you know the Democratic Party was the party of white supremacy and segregation? Yeah, we all knew. Yeah. We've been teaching it in books and classes for hundreds
Did you know
of years.
They all moved over to the Republican Party in the 1960s?
Yeah. That's suddenly the conspiracy. Yeah. So this sense of there's a conspiracy and I'm letting you in on some secret knowledge that you can then use in your fights is the way this all works.
Well, and that is, you know, you just pointed out something really important in this. That is one of the big things is they think there's a value in and of itself of owning the libs, of fighting with people, of presenting alternative, you know, historical facts and saying, debate me, bro. And it is a weird cultural artifact of post 1994 conservatism that having an alternative set of facts, to quote Kellyanne Conway, empowers you to own the libs, to win battles. I mean, Ben Shapiro says that to people all the time. I will debate them on facts and logic. And it's not all fact and it's not all logic. It's frankly a very emotional appeal to people who feel, and I'm going to get in so much trouble. There is and I've seen it in 100 focus groups. It's not economic anxiety. It's social anxiety and social jealousy.
Correct.
And an anger about elites and about the educated, where they feel like, because they've been fed this by Fox and everybody else, oh, you're the oppressed class. You know, you poor middle class white guy. You are the one who's really suffering in America. So you've also written a lot about the sort of the emergence and corporatization of evangelical Christianity, which is another. Hey, folks, on the podcast today, we're touching race and religion. So let's just go ahead and churn the water. But you've talked about a lot, sort of like the way evangelical Christianity has been weaponized and corporatized and branded and marketed in this country. And I don't think a lot of people, even inside the evangelical movement. And while I was a Republican and a conservative, I was never an evangelical. I was never a social conservative, like by any description. Talk to us a little bit about how that's happened and how that's changed our culture.
Well, my second book called One Nation Under God, I talked about this process in which we're all familiar with kind of the markings of religious nationalism in America. You know, they're maybe seeming to be small things. In God we trust, on the dollar bill in your pocket or on the coins in your pocket, or, one nation under God as a part of the Pledge of Allegiance. And the traditional story had been that all these things happened in the 1950s, and they happened solely because America was at war with the Soviet Union.
Right.
And the Soviet Union is made up of atheistic, godless commies. Well, we've got to embrace religion at home. That's a story I'd always learned. What I found in researching this book, though, is that this fight comes about, this change comes about in the 50s, largely because of a longer process that started in the 30s, and it's about businesses being opposed to the New Deal, right? And they fight against the New Deal. They want to dismiss this as kind of, this kind of status monstrosity. The problem is no one in the 1930s is listening to big business because they got them into the depression, right? And so their reputation is in the dumps. So who do they get to make this message for them? They get a couple sympathetic ministers to do this. And so they start promoting this idea of freedom under God as opposed to slavery under the state. So it's a version of a libertarianism that is called at the time Christian libertarianism, because normal libertarianism doesn't have that religious angle. Anyway, long story. It gets them involved in this process, and it starts this marriage of Christianity and capitalism, which had long been seen as odds, but they really do find a way to convince evangelical and fundamentalist Christians, and actually other Protestants too, that you can actually combine Christianity and capitalism. In fact, they're inseparable. They're both these systems in which the individual rises and falls on their own merits. You either go to heaven or make a profit, or you go to hell or you go bankrupt, right? And so from that starting point, there's really been a really closer relationship between not all faiths, but there's been a real trend on the right of the so-called prosperity gospel, right? And we've seen versions of this before, but it really came roaring back in the 80s and beyond, and we see it today. And they ignore all the many lines that Jesus had about cautioning against wealth, and rich man can't get into heaven,
right?
And they jettison all that, and they say, no, actually, making money is a sign of God's favor on you, and a sign of your success, and you should brag about it, right? That's a sign of God's favor. And so they've really made peace with this in really remarkable ways. It goes against I'm Catholic. It goes against the catechism that I grew up with. But others have convinced themselves that this is the way to go.
Yeah, and that prosperity gospel, that Creflo Dollar, Joel Osteen, there was I think you could argue there's a really clear emergence of, and going back to what like Trump's only exposure to Christianity growing up was at the Marble Church, and that was proto or 1.0 prosperity gospel, and very much Norman Vincent Peale, the social aspect of Christianity, and that was wrapped up in money and success and position, but the modern era of those evangelical churches, they are a business, they are weaponized, they are political. Believe me, when I was a Republican, we had a guy at the Republican Party of Florida who was the evangelical megachurch guy. And it was a deal-making process. It wasn't like, oh, we believe this person's better on this or that issue. It was, let's make a deal. What are you going to give me? How much are we going to get out of this?
Right.
Who's going to pay this and that? And it was, it's venal and look, everything short of selling indulgences, and they kind of do in a way.
They kind of do.
It gives people this sense of community and comfort. And look, plenty of problems in our society with people feeling isolated and broken and lonely, and those things are those are very appealing, I think, to a lot of folks who see a world changing rapidly around them. So as we go on into the weird 2024 election and the future, where this history we're writing now, how do you think people are going to look back in like 50 years on this window in our history?
Well, it's hard to make predictions in the moment. As an historian, I'm trained in hindsight, and I'm always conscious of the people in the past who made really bad predictions. Goldwater gets wiped out in '64.
The Republican conservatives are gone.
Well, not really. Yeah, conservatives are gone. Yeah, so you've heard all those. But I will say we definitely live in interesting times that will be meaningful. Yeah. The disruptions I think we've seen, all the things that we have been talked about during the Trump era as unprecedented. That breakage will surely be noted. What happens next is yet to be written. But the fact that we have gone so far off the rails is really remarkable. We could right ourselves, and get ourselves back on track, I think, as we did after, say after Watergate. There was a real movement to make government better and cleaner. That could happen. Or we could continue to descend into chaos.
Yeah.
So stay tuned.
Yeah,
we'll see.
I mean, things do fall apart. They
do. And that's, I think, one of the real lessons of history is that I think a lot of Americans, to our credit, have a real optimism, despite our modern grumbling, but things are going to hold together. We're going to be okay. Things can go bad, and they can go bad quickly. And so don't get complacent about this and assume that that things are going to get better. I always like to remind students that, yes, Martin Luther King Jr. famously said that the moral arc of the universe bends towards justice. And then he went to work every single day to bend it himself, right? He didn't sit back and wait for it to happen, right? So we've got to all remain vigilant. We've all got to stay kind of fighting for our democracy because it's worth fighting.
I couldn't agree more. And you're right. The risk that things fall apart is underpriced in our political climate right now.
Yeah.
And look, I started out before I went into politics full time as a Soviet studies guy and studied Soviet history and Russian history and philosophy. And the Russians, and then I was in the Defense Department right after I got out of college as the Cold War is ending. And the shock among Russians we would interview and talk to was so profound. It still shapes everything that's happening there today. They really believed, as bad as the Soviet system was, as broken and corrupt and terrible as it was, that they would just always muddle through. They would always get by it. And even a more robust, resilient society like our own, which I will argue we are more resilient politically than the Soviets were, we are still on a risky spot. We're still in a very dangerous spot because authoritarianism moves faster than democracy and hits harder.
Absolutely. And January 6th should really, there's a tendency, just like with Watergate, to kind of write it off. Well, yeah, we had a moment of crisis, but we got past it. Everything's fine now. No, that script can replay itself if we're not all careful. And so I think we need to realize that we dodged the bullet there. That doesn't mean the gun's empty.
Correct. 100%. Kevin Kruse, thank you so very much for a fantastic conversation today. We look forward to having you back.
Thanks for having me on, Rick.
Tell us where people can find you on social media.
I'm on, I don't know,
the things,
Twitter, Threads, posts, every single thing. Look for me. My handle is usually Kevin M. Kruse, my middle initial, Michael. I'm also on Substack, kevinmkruse.substack.com. I'm probably standing behind you in line at the grocery store right now. Look around.
All right. Well, Kevin, thank you so much for joining us today. And we will look forward to talking to you again very soon. Today's entry on the enemies list is Governor Brian Kemp of the great state of Georgia. Brian Kemp is a guy who stood up to Trump a little bit by refusing to, quote, give him 11,000 plus votes to win the election of 2020. And a lot of people looked at him as a hero. A lot of people thought of him as a good guy. I praised him at the time myself. But now, Brian Kemp, who desperately, by the way, wants to run for president, if not now, then in the future. Today, Brian Kemp came out basically and said he'd vote for Donald Trump after all the things he's done, after everything he knows. Still said, I'm going to vote for Trump because, the party. This is an example of the moral cowardice of the Republican Party writ large. This is an example of why there are no good guys left. Once Liz and Adam were out the door, the last people in the party who would stand up to this guy and be real about it, and maybe Chris Christie and Asa get a little bit of a silver star here, but this is a governor. This is a guy that the money people have been looking at and saying, "Ooh, he's the future. He's put together. He's not crazy. He's a Republican, a conservative. He'll do the tax cuts. He'll do the social stuff we want, but he's not Trump and he's not insane. He's just like it." Everyone who buys into this moral compromise of Donald Trump, of protecting him and voting for him, until you can say, I'm a Republican and I will not vote for a criminal. I will not vote for a man who's been indicted over and over and over and over again, who's been found guilty of sexual assault, who's been indicted under the Espionage Act, who's being indicted for voter fraud, who's going to be indicted for trying to orchestrate and organize the January 6th insurrection and the attempt to overthrow the U.S. government and overthrow a free and fair election. Until you can say, I can't vote for that guy, you don't deserve the title of Republican. You don't deserve the title of American. You don't deserve to be in public office. So Brian Kemp, you today are on the enemies list. Thanks again for listening to the Enemies List. If you have any comments, questions, or if there's someone you'd like to hear on the podcast, hit me up on Twitter at @TheRickWilson. Thanks again for the wonderful support you've shown the pod. We're growing fast. It really helps if you will share this with your friends, your family, and anyone else who, like us, is trying to save democracy. While you're at it, if you could rate and review the podcast, I would be very much appreciative. I know this is the sort of thing you've heard a billion times. Please rate, review, like, blah, blah, blah. But you need to do it. It really does help us a lot. We are slaves to the algorithm, my friends, and if you do this, it will help get the pod out further. Anyway, thanks again for listening. I'll see you next time. And remember, whatever you do, stay off the list.